Welcome to the Summit for Wellness podcast, where we help you climb to the peak of your health. And now, here is your host, Brian Carroll.
Have you ever had an injury that has prevented you from doing the things you love? Or maybe that injury stops you from doing everyday tasks like walking around or even driving. When we are in a position that we aren't used to being in, it can challenge us physically, mentally, and emotionally. And it can be tough to figure out how to handle these situations. We aren't taught how to work through mental sabotage. We either have to figure it out on our own or have someone else help guide us through it. What's up, everyone? I'm Brian Carroll, and I'm here to help people who have an injury or illness that holds them back from enjoying the outdoors. And today we will be talking all about psychology. Specifically, the focus is on sports psychology and how to keep your head in the game when things aren't going the right way. But these same principles can be applied in all areas of life. Before we dive into this episode is brought to you by our friends at Hana, who have a product that is perfect for this time of year because it has adaptogens which can help with the stress of the busy season, immune boosting agents to keep you healthy, and helps with mental focus and clarity. I had the founder of Hana on the show back at episode 26, and the way they source their ingredients is absolutely amazing and one of the best in the industry. So to learn more, go to summitforwellness.com/Hana. Now, let's dive right into my conversation with Barrymore Rosellini. Barrymore Rosellini holds a doctorate of psychology from the University of Denver, where he obtained training in behavioral, psychodynamic, and cognitive therapies, theories, and research. He completed a counseling and sports psychology postdoctorate fellowship at the University of Washington and is currently a counselor at Seattle Prep High School and sees clients at his private practice. Thanks for coming onto the show, Barrymore.
Yeah, definitely. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And as we start diving into what sports psychology is and why it is of interest for our listeners, let's learn a little bit more about you. So can you dive into your background, like who you are, why you got into psychology, and what it is you like to do?
Totally. Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Seattle, Washington. Back here right now, love Seattle. And I have a twin brother, two sisters, my parents, of course, and kind of throughout life, just having fun. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, to be honest, and went to University of Southern California for college. And looking back, it's interesting because as I was preparing to talk to you today, I remembered my college essay for USC, and it was basically about me waking up to watch the British Open at like 5 a.m., as a high school kid. And, kind of not only to demonstrate how, passionate I am about something, that I'll do something about it, but also I remember talking about Tiger Woods and like, why is he so clutch? Which is so crazy because I totally didn't realize how interested I was this before I actually, got into college. And so went to USC, had the best time, got my degree in psychology. And I remember after that, I was trying to figure out, what do I want to do next? And I thought of, going the psychology route, but also maybe how can I incorporate sports in there? Love sports, played them my whole life. One of my favorite things to do, how I related to people too when I was growing up. And so I remember I talked to the sports psychologist at UW at the time. This was like 2009. Dr. Jim Bowman was his name. And he's like, if you really want to go this route, first get your doctorate in clinical or counseling psychology, and then kind of come back to it, or see if you can get some training in sports psychology while you're in there. And that was interesting to me because sports psychology, when we look back, usually goes through kind of a kinesiology route, or they have like a sports psychology PhD route. But the field's kind of moving, I'd say, in this direction where, having that background in clinical or counseling psychology too is really important, because you get kind of a broad sense of, how to work with someone. And an athlete is a human being that struggles and lives and relates to others too. And so I think it gives you a better sense of background. So anyways, I went to University of Denver for graduate school and got my doctorate in clinical psychology there. Had a lot of experience working with kids, adolescents, adults, older adults. Worked in all kinds of settings, from like a substance use clinic. Worked with a neuropsychologist helping with like ADHD type testing, and started working with young adults more and more, I'd say, as I went on. And once I almost finished up my doctorate, I went to Washington State University, the counseling center, for my internship. So that's like the last year of your doctorate. And there, of course, working with college students there, anxiety, depression, relationships issues, bipolar, all sorts of kind of clinical issues there. I was like, dang, like, how do I get back into, sports psychology? And when I was at Denver, I had taken a couple classes throughout that, my time there, and learned a lot from some great professors there, but hadn't had as much direct experience as I would have liked in sports psychology. So started calling, just like cold calling, every sports psychologist I could find, really, and ended up finding out that there was postdoctoral fellowships that you could apply to. So I applied to the one at University of Washington, which was incredible. I remember waking up being like, please, like, how am I going to figure out what's next for me? Because this was right around when I was finishing up my internship, and all of a sudden on like job posting, like it said UW, University of Washington, sports psychology postdoctoral fellowship, and I was like, boom! I applied like 20 seconds later. I was like filling out the application, and ended up getting it. So at UW, I was working with athletes in terms of counseling. Also, I was doing evaluations for ADHD, learning and disabilities for new student athletes coming in there. And I also got to teach this sports psychology class with my supervisor at the time, Dr. Cassie Pasquariello. And so that was an incredible experience. And then kind of moving forward, I was like, again, like, what do I want to do, right? And I ended up realizing I wanted to try out and see what it was like to have my own private practice, and have a lot of flexibility there. So started a private practice, have had that for a few years now. And along those same lines, also to get started, I got into like working with eating disorders with athletes. So I was at this clinic called Opal Food and Body Wisdom, which is right in Seattle, and it has a athlete specific track. So I was working a lot with athletes with eating disorders for a couple of years. And then that kind of leads me to, I know I'm giving a lot of background here, today, where I just last year started at my old high school as a high school counselor, which I'm really excited about, loving it there. And then I also have my private practice where I work with some athletes, but also some general members of general population as well. Yeah.
And you had mentioned that for sports psychology, the athletes are still people as well. So is there much of a difference between sports psychology and just regular psychology?
Good question. I think there's some similar things, of course, we all experience, right? Anxiety or maybe feeling down, relationships, of course. But I think sports psychology, there's like a unique culture within the world of sport that is a little bit different. You're relating to a coach, right, in a different way, or maybe your teammates, but some of the concepts still apply and are the same. So right, in sport, maybe there's an insider outsider type group culture, which is the same in a group, in group, outside of group, in high school, for example. But I think there are a lot of unique concepts specific to sport which make sports psychology a bit different. For example, athletic identity, you are spending all your time and energy for a long period of time doing one specific thing, and you're pushing your body and mind to the maximum, right? In a lot of other areas, you might not be doing that. There's also this idea of, transitioning in and outside of sport, which, can be really hard, right? If you're someone who's played for forever and ever, and then all of a sudden you have to leave the sport due to injury or on your own terms, that's going to look a little bit different, I think. than a member of the general population that's not an athlete. So I think there is some similarities, and I think there's a lot of differences too, and that's where sports psychology comes in, I think.
And what's a good age range for sports psychology? Because, I'm sure you probably know Michael Gervais. He works with the Seattle Seahawks, so that's obviously a professional level. But can middle school or high school athletes benefit from sports psychology?
Totally. I think it's coming more and more to the point where the earlier the better in terms of teaching sports psychology skills. And really, when we talk about sports psychology, it's like, how do we understand and work with the mental world in sport? And when we're a kid, a younger kid, it's all about, a lot of the times, fun, which is awesome. And sometimes that's like the work with the older adult athlete, is how do you get it to be fun again? Because you've lost the motivation, so to speak. But yeah, when we talk about middle school, high school, if a high school athlete is able to learn how to hone in, focus, get present after they mess up, and practice those skills over and over again, or develop a mental routine in middle school, right, that you have and you can go back to every time. If we do that as a middle schooler, we're going to be so much better in the moment if something comes up down the road than if we start that age 25 when we're in the professional league or college, right? So I think we can totally hit it early on.
And yeah, especially with middle school athletes, because there's, it's such a different environment for a lot of them. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of physical changes, a lot of emotional changes as well. It could be a really great time to start working through some of that so that they're able to put more focus into their athletics and be able to start to excel at that as well.
For sure. Yeah. I think, it can definitely help, improve performance, but also, improve aspects of their life as well, and how we deal with, right, adversity. So I think there's transferable skills, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But it's interesting because at the same time, if we're a young athlete, let's say middle school, high school, we're teenagers, right? And at that time, have you ever heard of that like psychological term, imaginary audience?
Mm-hmm.
So basically it's this idea, and it comes up most often, I'd say, in teenagers, that everyone's like looking at you, that all the attention is on you. And so, if we have a pimple or something, that's a good example. Like, oh my gosh, everyone's looking at me. I'm going to be humiliated. But so it's at a time where we're so focused on what people are thinking of us, basically. And yet, like, in terms of sports psychology, that's a huge idea to work through and be able to perspective shift, is making it not so much about what other people are thinking and more about focusing in on whatever the task at hand is. And so it kind of is interesting that, one of the hardest things I think to teach is that kind of perspective shift. And yet it comes at a time, if we're teaching it to adolescents, where they are so focused on what others are thinking of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point, because I remember back in my athletic days thinking that everyone's, staring at you and watching everything you do, and if you screw up, they're going to see it. So how do you work through that? How do you teach people that people aren't just staring at you 24/7 and that you should be focused on the task at hand instead of what others are thinking?
Definitely. That's a really good question. And it's tough. I remember someone who was, so focused on, the color of their socks, and I swear, like, that it was affecting their performance because they were worried about, what the other people were thinking of them. And I guess to work through it, I think it all starts with awareness, right? So I might have a whiteboard sitting with a, younger or older athlete, and say, what's the precipitating event or the thing that they're worried about. Oh, I missed a shot, and then everyone's looking at me, let's say. And then we kind of, on the whiteboard, go through their thought process. What does that mean? Well, they think X, Y, Z about me. And then, okay, what does that make you feel, right? So it's almost like a cognitive behavioral way of looking at things. and really breaking it down. And so maybe they say, oh, I feel humiliated. And then breaking it down further, what does it make you do or want to do? Withdraw. I want to sub myself out of the game, for example. And so just seeing it and being aware of it, and right, a lot of times the young athlete might be like, oh my God, it's so much more, this is ridiculous. Like, I can't believe I thought that just from someone looking at me a certain way, right? Or missing a layup and all this stuff happened that I took myself out of the game. And the other thing is, I think just over and over again, talking to the athlete about what's useful, right? It's just not useful to focus on what other people may be thinking or feeling if you want to be good at what you're doing. So when it comes to like distractions like that, almost like the internal ones, it's almost less about like blocking it out per se, and more about how do we focus in on the next important thing in what I'm doing. But the perspective shift, that is hard to get a young person to realize. Even if I go 0 for 10, for example, in basketball or baseball, I'm in a slump. That doesn't mean anything about me. And all the social part of it, that's all stuff we create. It doesn't matter. I'm still the same person. And there's this great. Have you ever heard of the inner game of tennis?
Mm-hmm.
It's this old sports psychology book. I can't remember if it's the 70s, somewhere around there, but it's kind of gaining traction again, I would say. And there's this one example where basically there's player A on one side of the court, player B on the other side of the court, and then the umpire, right, that's up in the chair, and he talks about if player A hits it in the net, what's player B thinking and feeling, what's player A thinking and feeling, and right, player B's like, oh, this is great, I just got a point. Player A might be like, oh my gosh, I suck, what's wrong with me, if they're focused on making a dumb mistake. And the umpire might say, if it hits the net or it goes out, right, like out, or it hit the net. And how can we take a step back and be more like the umpire, look at it objectively and figure out, oh, it went in the net, I got to bend my knees to get it over the net next time. So, which is a lot more useful. So I know I went into a lot more detail there than probably you were looking for, but that's a couple things.
Okay, so let's talk more about distractions, because back when I was in high school, I didn't even have a cell phone until I was 16, and at that point, I only had 100 text messages a month available. So from a phone and social media standpoint, there was no distractions like that even available at that time. But now the kids nowadays, they're all over social media. They're connected to everything via their phones, and they have all these other distractions available. So how do you work with these athletes to be able to set aside these distractions while they're playing and to be able to focus at practice and in games and not think about their phone all the time?
Totally. Yeah, I'd say right now teens are spending so much time on social media and phones, and it can definitely be distracting. And I mean, there's a lot of research linking it to amount of hours used, correlating with mental health type issues. Not to mention, let's say they are worried about their performance, and then someone writes something on social media. If maybe they're more of an elite athlete, that's even more kind of distracting, or might impact how they're doing. So when it comes to a teenager, a young athlete though, and how do we work with them, I think it's about talking with them frankly about, is this useful to you in your sport? If we're talking specifically about sports, and they might say at first, well, yeah, like I like to have something to do after, and it helps me connect with people, and but if they say, well, dang, like I'm on the court during practice and all I can think about is texting this person or looking at Instagram or whatever it is, right? Then they hopefully will realize, whoa, that's not useful. I'm not here for my team. And a lot of times, if an athlete really, really loves their sport, that's what's going to take priority. Usually, when I'm, working, I don't see that as much where a athlete is wanting to get on their phone or things like that. specifically with sport, but more so generally, that's constantly what they're doing outside of school or their sport. And that's where it's like, they might be feeling disconnected, and they're trying to connect maybe through this artificial means, which is, social media, rather than per se, right, in person. And that can really affect, I think, someone, especially if all they're seeing is all these great things that people are posting, right? So coming back to your question, I really think talking about the usefulness of using the social media for, and how it might affect your ability to perform if you're focusing on that stuff. And, ideally the athlete's going to realize, okay, this stuff isn't helpful. How do I reduce? How do I cut down? And if once you have buy-in, that's where you can start to, right, put limits on it. But if it doesn't come from them, right, if a parent's like, hey, you need to do this, or I say immediately going into a session, hey, you should cut down this, look on your phone app and cut it down. Usually there's a lot of resistance there at first. I think there's got to be buy-in.
Do you have to show them how it can be distracting for their performance? Do you have to give some examples of, when you missed that shot or you weren't focused in the game and the team didn't perform the way that the team should have performed? What was going through your mind, or what was distracting you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think using either metaphors or their own right performance can be really helpful in terms of getting that buy-in and helping illuminate what the distraction is. So if a athlete's telling me, or maybe we watch a game of someone with bad body language or something like that after they mess up or get distracted, but using their own performance can be helpful. So let's say they are like, yeah, well, I wasn't really focused in the game yesterday. I was just not doing my best. And then, right, if they say something like that, then I can really zoom in on what's going on. And they're like, well, my girlfriend, she said something mean to me the other day, and it was just bugging me. And then I say, okay, so were you, let's say they're a soccer player. So when that happened, were you focused on the task at hand, passing the ball, shooting the goal, or what? And they say, well, no, when I was thinking about that, I wasn't really talking as much to my teammates. I wasn't really hustling as much. And I was just kind of bummed out. When I'm bummed out, I don't really play as well. Boom, right there we see how a distraction off the field might affect what's going on the field. And then they're going to be a lot more likely to want to, make some changes. And it's not about invalidating them and saying, hey, it's not okay to be sad about, your girlfriend saying something mean. It's more about, okay, let's acknowledge and accept, whatever that feeling is when you catch yourself in it, and then move on to the next thing that's going to be important. So in soccer, next touch. In baseball, next pitch. You can kind of create some sort of self-talk around it, I guess.
Let's talk a little bit about disappointment. So at some point, every athlete is going to go through some type of disappointment from a loss, or it could be an injury or something along those lines. How do you work through those disappointments and stimulate them to stay positive about the outcome to be able to continue to perform better next time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, disappointment, very, very hard thing to deal with. And yet, part of what makes it, I think, easier is being able to frame it as, hey, this is part of the deal. If you play a sport, if you live your life, right, pain or disappointment is part of the deal. That's inevitable. And almost being able to take it as a growth perspective. So almost like setting the stage when you're working with an athlete or non-athlete in a way, that disappointment is part of the deal. I'd say right after it happens, I would not take that approach where, try and say that. I think first step is acknowledging, understanding where they're at, how it's impacting them as an athlete. And because I think the more we avoid or resist whatever those automatic, feelings are, let's say it's a session right after a game, right? the more it's going to be there. But the more we can acknowledge and accept what happened and how disappointed we are, first, then that's easier to heal from and move forward. And then we can start to incorporate, okay, like, what do you want to change? What can you control now? We could spend hours and hours in sessions looking back on this and, how frustrating and annoying it was. Or we can say, what can I take from this and move forward from this? And that's, that can be a really motivating thing. So I'd say first acknowledge, where they're at, explore that a little bit. And then being able to use that as fuel to, stay motivated and move towards like that next goal or that next thing that the athlete wants.
And for a lot of athletes, it can take a while to bounce back from a disappointing loss. But I work a lot with wrestlers, and a lot of times they'll have tournaments where they have 4 to 5 matches per day, and they could have a couple days of that, and they only have a few hours in between each match. So when someone is in like a tournament setting where they have to bounce back quickly, what are some strategies that they can use to be able to let go of the match they just lost or the game they just lost and come back ready for the next match or game?
Definitely. And so to work with that again, like a quick, I'm not sure how long, you have between those matches, but a quick, hey man, this sucks, right? Acknowledging wherever you're at, I think is useful, and taking a few breaths, processing it, and then kind of shifting your focus towards, okay, what can I do for my next match? And I think being able to have the perspective, which you probably heard a lot of, okay, even though I'm 0-1, right? Let's just say I lost the first match in the second match, being able to bring it back and say, I'm 0-0. I'm 0-0 every single time. What do I need to do next? Is huge, because otherwise, if we're, how do I put it, like coming from mentally like that we're at a deficit, that doesn't feel good usually. But if we say, hey, I'm 0-0, all I can do now is control what's next. That's really, really important. So getting back present, right? You can do that mentally through, cognitively. And I think having some sort of right routine, maybe it's breathing for 5 minutes or 2 minutes even, right? Just taking breaths, being mindful of your breath, taking that time to take a step back, and then some sort of mental cue, right? So saying to yourself, all right, all I can control is what's next. Who do I want to be, on the wrestling floor right now? And maybe we have, right, if I was working with this athlete, a 3-part kind of identity of what we want to bring: intensity, aggressiveness, constantly moving, right? Those 3 things. Like, it's nice to have something to come back to focus on that is motivating and task oriented, so that we come back. So maybe that's that last thing you do before you get ready for your next match.
And then you and I have talked about this a little bit off air, but we talked about how kids specialize in a sport pretty early on nowadays, and when they specialize that early, it kind of becomes a part of them. Like, that's what they know. And so when they come to having an injury of some sort that could potentially be career ending or even take them out for a year, it can really put a number on their spirits and them, because it's like they lost part of themselves. So how do you walk through injuries, especially when it's so ingrained in someone that this is part of who they are?
Yeah, injuries are so hard for an athlete, and coping with them is very, very difficult. And just imagine, right? You're playing a sport, playing an instrument, right? For, let's say, 20 straight years of your life, and you're putting all this time and energy in it, and everyone sees you as, right, the gymnast or the French horn player or the soccer player, and that's really what you see yourself as, and you think you're going to go the next step and be professional and realize your dreams, and then you tear your ACL, right? And just put yourself in that in that position there. And man, like what would go through your head and your mind? And a lot of times it's like, oh my gosh, right? I'm ruined, you know, maybe some expletives there. Like, this is the worst. How am I ever going to come back from it? Right? This automatic shock. And, you know, many athletes might not know themselves so much outside of sport. So it's a big blow just immediately. And then to make matters worse, right? Let's say 8 months down the road, the doctor says initially it's going to take 8 months. You realize, hey, it's not progressing nicely. Now it's going to be another 4 months. And it's like, oh my gosh, you know, how do you stay motivated? And your spot might be taken, right? Someone, let's say you're playing football, someone immediately steps in right to where you were in your position and will start playing. So there's that piece to kind of cope with psychologically. And maybe the coaches are giving less attention to the injured athlete, or the athlete might start to feel like less of a team, less part of the team. And let's say that athlete, you know, socially connects mostly on the team. Then there's another element there where they might feel alone and disconnected. And so that's a lot of different ways that it can impact us psychologically. And so starting there is the key, like processing what happened. What does this mean to you? How is it affecting you? I think is the best kind of first step in terms of working with something like that. Because again, right, if I go with like, hey, well, there's lots of positive aspects of injury, that's like, you know, that's like telling a depressed person, hey, just be positive and everything's gonna be okay. It's just, right, it's not workable, and it's not validating. And so exploring it for a little bit and then being able to ideally move towards, okay, who am I outside of sport, right? We start to learn that if we're injured for a extended period of time. So you do get this opportunity to explore other aspects of our identity, connect socially maybe with people who are outside of our sport, practice mental skills, right? That's a big one. You can actually have time to, you know, practice them. And a big one that I see that happens is remembering why you started playing, right? Like, because you can't necessarily play at that time. And it really can increase motivation a lot in terms of, I just want to get out, right? Remembering when we were a kid and playing and how fun it was. And so it can help increase motivation as well. So getting to those positive aspects later on can be helpful in terms of working through it. There's a lot of, especially at colleges, like injured athlete groups, which can be helpful to realize you're not the only one. And there's other people going through this, and hearing how they're coping with it can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, the initial reaction after an injury definitely can be extreme. It kind of reminds me of the Seahawks player, I forget which one it was last year, that they got hurt on their first day back, and as they're getting carted off the field, they flip off the coach, and that was their reaction.
Oh yeah, or Thomas. Yeah.
Yep, that's right, Thomas. And it's, yeah, because at that moment, you know you're going to get replaced. And then on top of that, not only do you have the time that it takes to recover from the injury, but then you also have the time that it takes to get back to, first string, if you ever get back to first string, because you have to be better than the people that are starting now. So it's a long recovery process, and there's a lot that goes into it. And then, of course, at that level, too, that is their career. That's their lifestyle. That's the only way they make money.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I think you see a lot of those, knee-jerk reactions when athletes are injured that, to the outside look, why would they ever do that? But, if we put ourselves in that shoes and have a little empathy, gosh, it's like shattering your whole worldview in a way, sometimes dreams. And that sucks. That's hard.
Yep. Well, it's kind of like if you're working at, a corporation or anything, and then all of a sudden they fire you and you're replaced the next day, you're going to be pretty pissed off about that too.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you're nothing to them. They can replace you tomorrow. And that's exactly the same thing in the athletic situation too.
Exactly.
So let's talk about parents' investment in their child playing sports, because a lot of times it seems like there's always at least that one parent that is more interested in the sport than their child is. And it's like they're pushing um, really hard for their child to be successful. And it kind of takes the fun away from the kid. So, how do you communicate with kids to play the sport for themselves and not just for the accomplishments and expectations that their parents have for them?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And it's hard because I think kids, growing up generally, right, we want our parents to be proud, and we don't want to disappoint them, and that creates a lot of right pressure and expectation. And even if a parent doesn't directly, right, say something, or not super overly involved, there might be these kind of signs that the kid picks up on, right? Kids are perceptive, and feel that pressure. So how do you separate from that? If I'm working with a student athlete, getting them to talk about and explore their own right feelings and love for the game, so that we're focusing more on the intrinsic motivation first, is important, and can help make a shift. But also talking out loud about, what's it like on the field when your parents are doing this, or what do they want for you, right? So exploring that, and the key there is not like telling them what they should be thinking or feeling or giving advice, but just reflecting back what they're saying about their right parents' perceptions and certain behaviors, because it's almost like I'm holding up a mirror to that student athlete, so that ideally, right, they can see this in the mirror and realize, hey, my perceptions are different from my parents. How can I right, take some of that autonomy away? And the other piece that is big, I remember the University of Washington women's soccer coach, I think she must have just stepped down recently, but she was the coach for like 20 something years. Leslie Gallagher is her name. And when I was at UW, she was giving this talk about failure, and she was saying how she had this promising career, going towards, I think it was law maybe, but what she really wanted to do was become a soccer coach. Like that's where her passion lied, and she was really worried about disappointing her parents, because stable career was this law direction, soccer, not sure if that would work out, right? And she was talking to a therapist, ironically at the time, who said, like, and this always stuck with me, like, ultimately, if you are happy and it shows in who you are and what you're doing, the parents are gonna jump on board. And that always stuck with me in terms of, for a young athlete, how do you get that intrinsic motivation, do the things the way, right, you want to do, in your sport. And ideally parents are gonna jump right on when they see that, even if that means, let's say, they don't want to play this sport anymore. If that's what truly is going to make the kid happen, ideally, right, the parent's going to jump on board. But it's tough. It is tough because there is all those pressures from parents, spoken and unspoken, for these young athletes.
Well, let's start wrapping things up. You already gave a couple examples of different ways that athletes can start working through different mental routines, but can you give us a couple more examples?
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, routines take many different shapes and forms, because you could do a mental routine, a longer one, right, before a performance, or before a free throw even, right, a specific thing, or in response to a mess up, right, to get you back on track, to get you back present. And so let's say basketball, you're taking a free throw. It's important to incorporate like mental and physical aspects to the routine. So one might be, after working with the athlete and figuring out what works best for them, okay, we dribble 3 times, we take a breath, right, a deep breath, and we would practice that together. And then there's some sort of mental cue or self-talk, let's say nice and smooth, right? Let's say that's like the motion that we want for the free throw, and then they go for it and shoot it. So, right, we have physical, mental with the breath, and also the self-talk, and then you kind of go for it. And self-talk's interesting because you can use, right, more feeling-oriented self-talk, like, you got this, or you can do this, encouraging type self-talk, or more task oriented, which would be like, in a way nice and smooth as both, but could be elbow in, right? Would be a task oriented type cue. And you got to figure out what works best for the athlete that you're working with. Another type of routine might be, of course, in a batter's box, right? Or a baseball player going into the batter's box. We usually see a lot of these, right, physical routines. But something there might be, right, on your shoe, in the sole, or on the little, I can't remember what it's called, the tongue, I think it's called. You flip it up, and maybe you've written on there some little thing that helps motivate you. So FFF, family, friends, focus, or family and focus, or something like that. And so that kind of brings you in the moment. You take in the crowd, let's say, you do a little circle, you pick up the bat, 3 practice swings, visualize the next pitch. That could be kind of your routine. A pregame routine, right? Maybe you spend, once you do your layup line, right? In basketball, for example, or tennis, you're hitting balls back and forth. Then you go to your bench. You spend 1 minute breathing. You remember why you like to play the game of X, Y, Z, and that's part of the mental rehearsal. And then incorporate some sort of physical cue. So you jump 3 times. I know LeBron, you see, right? Or at least he used to clap the that white stuff chalk, on his hands. And then the last thing you might do, focus on what you want to bring to the game that day. Intensity focused, being a beast on the boards, let's say, if it was basketball. So there's so many different ways that you can incorporate a routine. I know I read this one article about Michael Phelps, this, Olympic swimmer, and the night before matches sometimes he would black out his goggles, right? And just lay there and imagine all the different types of ways, right? If something went wrong on a turn, how would he get back into the position that he needs to be? So imagery can play a big part in a routine as well.
Awesome. Well, those are great different types of routines. So thanks for sharing that. And then
Totally.
My final question for you is, do you have a morning routine? And if so, what is it?
Do I have a morning routine? I would love to have a more well-developed morning routine. So I would say right now, personally, I'm still working through figuring out what's going to work best for me. But the kind of routine I'd say I'm in the middle of developing. I'm going to be honest, it's not there yet. Is waking up around 6:15, getting out of yoga mat, doing a few yoga stretches, 20 push-ups, 20 sit-ups, right? So it's not like a big exercise thing or anything like that. Then making some coffee, drinking the coffee, showering, and then going about my day. So that's a really small one. That's what I'm hoping to get to. I'm not there yet, but gosh, everything I've read, everything I have heard, and what I want to do is develop that morning routine. So not there yet, though.
Do you do any mental preparations as well?
Mental prep for me, that's, and maybe I gotta switch it to my morning routine, but that's something I do at night. Is right before I'm laying in bed. What I try and do is take stock of the day. What are the moments that brought me joy, right? Life-giving moments per se. What are the ones that weren't so good? And then what can I do? What do I want to do to be better the next day? And it's not even that I always think of the right thing that I want to do better. It's just the idea of committing to wanting to be better the next day. Sometimes I include some sort of gratefulness. What are the top things that I'm grateful for? But for me, it helps kind of center myself a little bit before I go to bed.
Awesome. Well, Barrymore, where can people find you?
So best way to find me, my website. So it's www.barrymoreRosellini, which is PSYD.com. And that has a little bit more about me and my private practice And probably the best way to find me, reach me, contact me would be through my website.
And for the private practice, is that all in person, or do you do it online as well?
That is in person. In person. Sorry. Every once in a while, I'll do kind of a phone consult or things like that, but in person generally.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Barrymore, for coming onto the show. We appreciate it. And I'm so fascinated by the world of sports psychology, and there's so much more we could dive into, but we'll have to do that another time.
Totally. Thanks so much for your time. This was awesome.
How the human brain and mind works is something that has been fascinating me more and more. And this episode only touches on a couple things that can be a distraction for people. When you start looking at your own life, just think of all the little things that influence how you perceive each day. Maybe your kids did something that threw you off, or traffic was bad getting to work. Or maybe you had one beer too many yesterday and it is causing you to not feel great today. We all have things we are dealing with, and if we recognize it, then we can change how we view our lives. We probably will understand the actions done by others as well. Again, I find all of this extremely fascinating, and it just allows me to take a step back from things and look at it from a bird's eye view. Did you know we have detailed show notes for every single episode, and it includes timestamps of important moments in the show, links to any resources, full transcripts, plus more? If you are like me and listen to podcasts while doing other things, then it can be hard to remember all the neat little details from an episode. So if you want a refresher from any episode that we've done, go to summitforwellness.com/the episode number to view that specific episode. So for this episode, you can see all the show notes at summitforwellness.com/89. When I first started in this industry, I would give clients an extremely rigid and detailed plans of actions to help them achieve their health goals. But you know what I discovered? Most people failed at following the plan. Why is that, you ask? Did the program suck? Well, on paper, the program was exactly the steps they needed to feel better, but the plan wasn't realistic enough for people to follow. You can't go from the couch to a marathon overnight, and it is better and more realistic to take baby steps and work on changing small habits one at a time and making sure they stick, which is exactly what we do in our health programs now. We help you to make lasting habit changes that will make you feel better without falling off the bandwagon. So if you are tired of the yo-yo diets and want to make lasting changes, visit summitforwellness.com/ready. Next episode, we are going to focus on type 2 diabetes and strategies to navigate a complex disease. Let's go meet my guest, Dr. Nikki Steinberger. I am here with Dr. Nikki Steinberger. Hey, Nikki, what is one unique thing about you that most people don't know?
In the early 80s, I followed the Grateful Dead for a couple of years, and it was a very family feeling, bonded, transformational experience.
I actually am not familiar with that. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
So, the band, the Grateful Dead, which doesn't exist anymore, but back in the day, the Dead toured all over the country. And so we would have vans and cars going from the East Coast to the West Coast, staying multiple people in hotel rooms, selling food at shows and tie-dyed shirts, and then going into the show, which was 2-3 hours, and dancing our butts off, taking some fun psychedelics, and having a great old time.
It sounds like a great time. Wow. Well, what will we be learning about in our interview together?
So we are going to dig into mindset in a fairly deep way and create that bridge between mindset and health, mindset and type 2 diabetes. Take a look at how different mindsets can produce different results for folks. So we can open up that idea and have choice.
And what are your favorite foods or nutrients that you think everyone should get more of in their diet?
So in no particular order, and all organic, of course, avocados, okay, for their monounsaturated fats and fiber and satiety. Organic blueberries, high in antioxidants and low on the glycemic index, right? If we're going to eat fruit, they are lower in sugar. Raw pecans and walnuts for the, again, monounsaturated and omega-3 fatty acids. And then bone broth to increase immunity and reduce inflammation from those high quality amino acids.
And what are your top 3 health tips for anyone who wants to improve their overall wellness?
Number 1, recognize that stress reduction is needed in practices in a daily way. We have to really influence our parasympathetic nervous system. So that can look like a little bit of meditation, deep breathing, yoga, a walk in nature, a hot bath. Very, very important and often overlooked. Number 2, we must move our body. We're not meant to be sedentary. And this helps move the sugar from the blood into the cells. And it helps with our musculoskeletal system, our organs, and our mood to keep us having a steady, loving mood. And the third is to surrender and get rid of processed food-like products, refined and processed sugars and carbohydrates.
Type 2 diabetes is becoming more prevalent, and it is predicted that 1 in 2 people will develop it. So if you want to avoid